Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. We are excited to have you with us on this special occasion. For those of you who don't know me, I am Johnny Mars, president of Temple Israel of Hollywood. This has been an exciting year in the life of our synagogue. As you know, all year long, we have been celebrating our senior rabbi, John Rosove, in honor of his 30 years of service to TIOH and his 40 years in the rabbinate through a series of celebration events before he retires at the end of this month. Wow, that was a little sad for me to say. In February, we held a community Shabbat service and lunch in honor of Rabbi Rosove. In March, Craig Talman led a musical Kabbalat Shabbat service. In April, we heard from David Axelrod and Todd Purnham, both in conversation with Adam Nagurney as part of our speaker series. Also in April, we honored Rabbi Rosove at our annual gala, and it was at that gala that I announced we would be welcoming former Attorney General Eric Holder to TIOH to receive the inaugural Rabbi John Rosove Justice Award. The Justice Award was established to recognize leaders across the nation for their important justice work and to bring them to TIOH to educate and engage with our community. It is named in honor of Rabbi Rosove in recognition of his life's work of promoting social justice in its many forms and contexts. Temple Israel has always been a leader in this area, and Rabbi Rosove's dedication to social justice and effecting change has continued to engage and galvanize our community. Rabbi Rosove has an extensive and rich history of social activism, both before and during his time at Temple Israel of Hollywood. As a young college student at Berkeley, John was arrested during a peaceful march in protest of police killing an innocent man. I believe this was the first of his 2 arrests for protesting injustices. As a rabbi in San Francisco, Rabbi Rosove led a committee that settled 32 Hmong refugees from Cambodia in association with Jewish Family Services. At Washington Hebrew Congregation in Washington, D.C., his congregation became a sanctuary synagogue, supporting El Salvadorian refugees fleeing the persecution in the 1980s from the death squads. Here at TIOH, the list is also long. Rabbi Rosove helped establish Mitzvah Day, which is now known as Big Sunday. He inherited and advanced the Christmas Dinner Project, which this year alone enlisted 300 TIOH volunteers who provided food, clothing, and other essentials to over 1,000 people in need. When the 1994 earthquake damaged parts of Messiah Baptist Church, Rabbi Rosove invited the church community to pray at TIOH. This gesture quickly developed into a long-standing partnership between our 2 communities. He's a champion of justice and democracy in Israel, fighting for religious pluralism, gender equality, basic rights for immigrants and all its citizens, and a 2-state solution. And closer to home, Rabbi Rosove has been and continues to serve as a signatory on multiple pledges and proposals to our local, state, and federal representatives, which push our message of social action beyond Los Angeles and has helped establish TIOH as one of the leading social justice synagogues in the nation. Through the generosity and efforts of Nicole and Alan Muchnick, we are thrilled to establish the Rabbi John Rosove Justice Award and to name its inaugural recipient. Please help me welcome Nicole and Alan Muchnick to the Bima.
Thank you, Johnny, for your leadership of the temple and your seemingly effortless, warm friendship with each one of the 900 of us families. On behalf of our community today, it's my honor to recognize and ask our temple's senior-most social action leaders to please stand. Rabbi Josie Hudson. Amazing. outgoing Vice President of Social Action, Heidi Siegel. Our incoming Vice President of Social Action, Sophie Sartain. And Rabbi Michelle Misagia. Thank you. You four women are the corner pillars of our social action tent. You can sit now. Thank you. Thank you. Good listening. So, you are the four corner pillars of our social action tent, sheltering the voteless, the voiceless, the sick, the needy, displaced, and dispossessed here in our community. So it is on your behalf today, and on behalf of all of our temples, letter writers and street marchers, our airport protesters, our criminal justice reformers, our fact checkers, our gun violence task force members, our pro bono lawyers, our event hosters, our newsletter editors, our gender justice task force members, our weekly lunch preparers, our Christmas dinner organizers, our housing and food security task force members, all of our Wednesday phone actioners, all of our Mitzvah Day volunteers, our food pantry donors, our refugee and immigrant task force members, our tutor corps, our Big Sunday creators, our nonprofit board members, and our 501c3 founders. And if I asked every one of you to stand, we know there would be no one remain sitting, because here at Temple Israel, we are among the centers of social action in this city. And on this bima, on this stage, where Martin Luther King and Golda Meir and rabbis of legendary moral clarity have spoken before, the eternal flame overhead lights our way towards justice today just as brightly as it ever has. It is on behalf of this community of activists and leaders that we warmly welcome the Mayor of Los Angeles to Temple Israel today. Mayor Garcetti is not only our city's leader, but he is truly our partner in seeking to repair our world. And I know that many of you are familiar with the mayor's work to solve, for example, the teachers' strike, the Port of Los Angeles dock workers' impasse, passed the largest transportation infrastructure program in the country, as well as 2 homeless and housing bonds. Not only did this mayor do all of those things, but he then passed on his lesson learned by creating a think tank action center, Accelerator for America, which is a toolbox for other cities of best practices to try to solve large-scale public problems. You may already know that our mayor is a Rhodes Scholar, married to Amy, a fellow Rhodes Scholar, and a U.S. Naval Reserve officer. But I bet that you didn't know that as a student at Columbia University, Eric founded the College Orientation Week of Community Service at that school for incoming students that continues today, 25 years later. And while you may know that the mayor is working hard to pass Measure EE, the education parcel tax for the kids of Los Angeles, you may not know that he and his wife are personally foster parents to several children, including newborn babies and teenage siblings. And you may not know, during this Pride Month, that for many years, he and Amy chose not to marry in light of the injustice that others in their community did not yet share the legal right to do so. So on behalf of Temple Israel, our community of leaders who leverage their blessings in pursuit of justice and fairness, it is my privilege to welcome not only our city's leader, but our social justice partner to present Temple Israel's inaugural John Rosove Justice Award.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you to Nicole and Alan. They're menschniks, not just muchniks. You guys are incredible in who you are and all that you do. It's great to be back here on the bima at my mother's first shul. And after that introduction, I wish I was just with her and my father. I wish she had been here to hear it. So Thank you for your overly kind words. Thank you all, most importantly, for your overly involved actions, which is what we need in this day and age. Radical, engaged action and less talk. And this is a synagogue that has always stood for that always honors that. To Rabbi Rosove, it is incredible to look at the breadth of what you have given this city and to think about how you have touched us to take action. And I didn't know you were arrested a couple times. So now you join us activists who have occupied dean's offices and laid down in intersections and spent nights in jail to put your body on the line, the true test. So it's good to be with a bunch of criminally justice-involved activists here today, and thank you for who you are. It's always a privilege to pay tribute to the incredible legacy here in the heart of Hollywood, arguably the most famous neighborhood anywhere in the world, to this community, both the specific community of Temple Israel of Hollywood and to the wider community in the City of Angels, with leaders like Johnny Mars and Carrie Hausner, Susan Meyer, Bill Spald, the spiritual guidance that we have from our entire team of rabbis here. This congregation has been a central thread in the fabric of this city. And it's been a central part of many moments in my own life as well. I've been honored to come here to commemorate, to rehear the words of Martin Luther King from this stage where he once spoke. The call to service and now Big Sunday that was born here and how that touches so many Jews and non-Jews alike. When Dr. Martin Luther King came here in 1965, and we know the story, of course, of him coming to this house of God to deliver an update on his extraordinary dream, to try to shake us and all Americans at that point out of what he called a, quote, stagnant complacency and deadening pacificity, and to move on to that great and noble realm of justice and brotherhood. When you think about those words this many decades later, and I think we feel them even now more in recent years than we have in a long time, I think there's few people in the last 30 years that have done more to shed light on that vision than you, Rabbi. And John, a native son of Los Angeles who has used this pulpit to take together the threads of social justice and of Jewish activism, of repair, of service, here is a leader who makes real what the sages once wrote, that any of us should find yourself a teacher and get yourself a friend. You have been the teacher of our Jewish history and values, our friend and counselor in trying times and in moments of celebration, and our guide in building that noble realm of justice. I can't think of a more fitting testament to your legacy than this award. I'm sure you hate this, the idea of an award named after you, because it's just, you're a Nike kind of just do it guy. But take a moment. There's an amazing poem from Pablo Neruda who says, it feels good every so often, I'm paraphrasing from Spanish, it feels good every so often to turn your face into the wind of innocence and to just feel. I hope you take a moment to celebrate, because all of us that are activists are never happy, right? There's always something more to be done. And at the end of our days, we forgot to take those pauses and those punctuations, those periods to end a sentence, those exclamations to celebrate, and those question marks to ask what comes next. So I hope you do today, John. And secondly, I'm so pleased to be here today because we celebrate, for the first award named after you, a man who is truly befitting of this honor. He has a title. We call him, of course, Attorney General, Eric Holder. But he has been, since he grew up in Queens, since he graduated from Stuyvesant and got 1 and then 2 degrees at my own alma mater, Columbia University. I didn't know you had occupied the dean's office, by the way. He occupied the dean's office to make sure there was a space for African-American students in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. We never have compared notes with Ben Jealous, who was a fellow activist and on the student council with me. We took over the same office, but it was Jack Greenberg, who was the dean at the time of NAACP fame, because they were going to cut full need financial aid or need blind admissions, which would have hit black and brown students worse. So thank you for inspiring the activism that was part of what others have carried on. Long before he became the first African-American Attorney General of this country, he was a trailblazer, a pioneer, and a warrior of justice. As a lawyer and legal scholar, he spent decades of his career at the Department of Justice in some of the most critically important positions for this nation's evolution of civil rights. I was reading a couple of speeches of the Attorney General before I got here, and one of the beautiful things he always talks about is that something like the Constitution, as beautiful as it is and how well it has worked, was not ever written in a vacuum. You have to understand context, that it's been youth who have pushed their elders to go further, that the same ambition, intellectual ambition of the founders, they didn't hope we would not have. And so as we evolve what rights mean, and as we take our activism forward, it is something that Eric Holder has spoken to this nation about, that we must do our part in each generation. Whether it's bringing public integrity to elected officials, which as one I appreciate, he stood up the first public integrity division within the U.S. Department of Justice to root out corruption among local and state officials. And also as a new lawyer, he swore an oath to defend the Constitution's pledge to establish justice, something he's talked about. And when President Clinton called on him to seek justice in the courtrooms of our nation's capital, he stepped forward again. He was the first U.S. attorney, first African-American U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia, our nation's capital. And when it became clear that the U.S. government could no longer defend unjust laws defining LGBTQ Americans out of the covenant of marriage, when it became clear that someone had to stand up against the assaults on voting rights in states where the franchise had been secured in blood through billy clubs and the bravery of the civil rights movement, when it became clear that our fellow Americans held back by the unjust rules and regulations in our criminal justice system, that was one strike and you're out, when we needed somebody to speak up for the rights of America, Eric Holder was there to be that person. Oftentimes, I think the longer those of us serve in public life, the more praise that is showered on the people at the top, and we certainly do, and it's deserved of his boss, Barack Obama. But it overshadowed that while we had the first African-American president, the first person of African-American descent to serve as our Attorney General was the turning of a page in this country in which the instrument of law has been used both against and by African Americans in the story of America. You know, when we read the history book of America, it seems so easy progress. A high school student can flip to page 78, and suddenly slavery is just over, like that, without thinking about how many people died in bondage. On page 92, women suddenly can vote in a country that soon will celebrate 100 years of that, though so many women who fought for that right died before ever casting a ballot, and African American women have only enjoyed that in many places for a handful of decades. When you look at GIs who never came home, when you look at those who said that their children shouldn't die because of pesticides sprayed on their children as farm workers, when you look at people who died without being able to marry whom they loved, do you realize how slow, if you're involved in that struggle, the writing of those pages goes, how painful the paragraphs can be? Eric Holder is one of the greatest writers of our chapter of American history. He has made sure in quiet ways and, when necessary, in loud ways, both in his time as a public official and now afterwards, that the holy things that we stand for, the civil rights of this country, the basic rights of voting and of inclusion, that they should be more than just ideals. They should be something in their practice. It reminds me of something that one of his predecessors, Robert F. Kennedy, said here in California once, that lawyers have their duties as citizens, but they also have special duties as lawyers. They have a continuing responsibility to uphold the fundamental principles of justice from which the law cannot depart, the fundamental principles of justice. That is what Eric Holder has upheld every day of his extraordinary career. That is how he has helped us break out of stagnant complacency and build a noble realm of brotherhood and sisterhood. That is why he is the ideal leader to honor right now. So it's my pleasure. We say, It's like this African-American kid from the Queens, this Jewish Latino kid from the Valley. So the Mexican side, we say somebody who's your namesake. You say tocayo, mi tocayo. So it's my honor to honor mi tocayo, a great brother in the fight for justice, our friend and the first recipient of the Rabbi John Rosove Justice Award, our Attorney General Eric Holder.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Mayor Garcetti, for that kind introduction. I just told him he was just supposed to introduce me, not give a stem-winding speech, you know, and I've now got to follow him. You have been a true leader for Los Angeles and an important voice in our national conversation about building a more inclusive democracy. He and I are the only two Democrats who are not running for president. He should have run, you know, but that's a whole other story. And thank you, Rabbi Rosove, and the members of the Temple Israel of Hollywood Synagogue for honoring me with your first annual Justice Award. It's a great privilege for me to be with all of you here today. Rabbi, you have led this synagogue for more than 3 decades. I find that hard to believe. I walked in at the reception earlier, and I'd read about this great man and all the great work that he has done over these past decades, and I saw this boy in front of me. And so I asked to see his driver's license. He's still not produced it, so I will take him at his word that he is as old as he claims to be, but the physical does not comport with that. But 3 decades with compassion and a steadfast commitment to social justice and education. Your work has touched the lives of so many here in Los Angeles, across our great nation, and indeed around the world. We are indebted to you. You have embodied the principles set forth in the book of Isaiah: to learn to do good, seek justice, reprove the ruthless, and defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Now, your deep faith has led you to acknowledge the humanity of all people and the responsibility that we all share to treat everyone with love and with respect. And I think that your example is needed now more than ever. The crisis that we face is one that I want to talk to you about today, but I want to speak very frankly with you. We are at a moment in the American journey when our institutions, our democratic systems, our values are all being tested. The administration in Washington, D.C. has let free a plague that we will be dealing with long after its architects and its directors have left office. Now, as has happened before, we are once again at a time in our nation's history when people of goodwill will need to band together to eradicate hatred and work together to advance the cause of civil rights. And to make needed progress, we must be honest. We have to be honest. Racism and anti-Semitism continue to exist in this great nation. The forces of racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism are viruses that always lurk in the body politic, always looking for ways to surface. Now, we watched in horror as neo-Nazis marched in Charlottesville, and were not roundly condemned by the leader of our nation. A recent study by the Anti-Defamation League found that in 2018, attacks against Jews and Jewish institutions occurred at historically high levels, and nearly twice as many as occurred in 2015. Now, we also know that this rise in violence and hatred is not focused on just one people. In recent years, people of diverse faiths, Jews and Muslims in particular, have been brutally attacked. We have seen violence in places of worship, at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and most recently, not far from here, at Chabad Poway. Now, if we're going to heal our divisions as a nation, if we're going to make real the Constitution's promise of a more perfect union, then we have to be frank. We have to be frank. We need to be honest about the challenges that we still face and where today we are as a nation. Progress is built on the foundation of hard truth. Now, what happens between now and 2020 will help to define who we are as a nation moving forward. The fact is that in 2019, America's long struggle to overcome injustice, to eliminate disparities, and to eradicate violence directed at certain groups has not yet ended. Those attitudes thought long gone have found life in the upper reaches of our executive branch and in those congressional leaders who have enabled this administration. The current occupant of the White House stokes fear and anger through dangerous and inflammatory rhetoric, with the result that too many Americans have come to distrust the very things that have always made this nation exceptional: tolerance, compassion, and the acceptance of those who are different. But more than rhetorical damage has occurred. This administration's policies have caused real harm. This president has mocked women who have come forward to share their painful stories of sexual assault, while his administration has rolled back protections that were put in place for survivors of sexual assault on college campuses. He has cheered a sitting congressman who physically assaulted a reporter while routinely calling the free press the enemy of the people. He has demonized immigrants while his administration has torn children from the arms of their parents on our southern borders and locked them up in crude detention centers. Now, in the past few years, I've traveled really extensively across America, and I often hear from people, especially from young people, who tell me that they feel lost in their own country, unsure of where they belong, and fearful that America's two long-standing divisions, now energized, are threatening to tear our nation apart. Now, this is indeed a time of significant challenge and great consequence. Now, throughout his life, Dr. Martin Luther King was no stranger to such moments. On the eve of his death, he delivered that seminal mountaintop speech that would be his final sermon. And Reverend King asked himself in that speech when, if given the choice of any period in time, he would choose to be alive. Well, Dr. King asked himself what era he would choose to experience and help shape. And his own, he ultimately decided. Happiness, he explained, comes from embracing the blessings and burdens of destiny and the opportunities that arise in difficult times. Only when it is dark enough, Dr. King said, can you see the stars. Well, today, once again, it is dark enough. We have not yet reached the promised land, but today, once more, we can see the stars. We see them in the courage and commitment of ordinary people nationwide, Americans of all ages, races, and backgrounds, who refuse to give in to fear and frustration, who resist shameful attempts to exploit and divide the American people, and who are keeping up the fight for the safety and civil rights of all. We see them in people who take to the streets and to the offices of their elected leaders to demand access to health care. We see them in the women of the Me Too movement, who have forced this nation into a long overdue reckoning about sexual harassment and sexual assault. We see them in the examples of those young people, kids really, who in the wake of senseless gun violence have found their own voices in calling for reasonable solutions that prioritize the safety of our communities and the lives of our children. It is times like these when the power of Dr. King's example and his enduring words are brought into stark focus. And one of the most important lessons he left is that it is necessary to be indignant and to be impatient so that it impels us to take action. The fact that Dr. King's strength was rooted in frustration just as much as in faith is a great comfort to me. Now, I say that because as proud as I am of our country, my country, and as grateful as I feel for the progress that we've made and the opportunities that have been made available to me, the truth is, like Dr. King, I am dissatisfied. I am dissatisfied that every day in America, 46 children and teenagers are shot. I am dissatisfied that economic progress remains uneven, that educational opportunity is far from uniform, and then in the face of these facts, simply acknowledging that Black Lives Matter too is controversial. I am dissatisfied that I've had to have the talk with my then teenage son the conversation that so many black fathers in America have had in order to protect their children about how to safely interact with law enforcement. But as the brother of a retired police officer and as someone who has spent his career working hand in hand with the women and men in law enforcement, I'm also dissatisfied that the unpunished bad actions by a few have sown widespread mistrust for the dedicated, honorable men and women who wear the badge. I am dissatisfied that too many women, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, lesbian, gay, and transgender Americans, and people with disabilities still yearn for unrealized equal opportunity and fair treatment. I am dissatisfied that state legislatures across the country are undertaking a new direct assault on the reproductive rights of women as part of a grotesque political strategy. I am dissatisfied that there has been a concerted effort to fill the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary at all levels with reactionary judges, some of whom refuse even to acknowledge, and this is true now, some of whom even refuse to acknowledge today, in 2019, that Brown versus the Board of Education was correctly decided. I've seen that in their confirmation hearings. And I am dissatisfied that more than a half a century after this nation passed the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965, for too many Americans, the right to vote and the assurance that one's vote is counted fairly remain under siege. The poll tax and Jim Crow may be relics of bygone eras, but ballot discrimination and voter disenfranchisement remain real problems today in the United States of America. Now, to me, this is the chief civil rights issue of our time. And in that regard, our nation is not as different as it should be from the America that existed during the time of my childhood. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 has justifiably been called the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. It enshrined into law that the ability to vote is not a privilege, it is a right. And as Lyndon Johnson said, and I quote, "The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice." Now, our nation's policies are determined by those who serve in elected office, and we must make certain that these representatives actually reflect the choices of the American electorate. Yet, in many communities today, our political system is far from fair. There has been a systematic effort to cripple our democracy and to disenfranchise those who may not subscribe to certain political views. It has been manipulated through racial and partisan gerrymandering. Our democracy has been impaired by provably false claims of widespread voter fraud, and it's been undetermined through shameless acts of voter and political suppression. Now, NDRC and Voting Rights, that's the organization that I lead. 2 years ago, with the support of President Obama, I helped to launch, and I'm proud to chair, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. The NDRC is working to make our democracy more representative by ending gerrymandering. We're working to build a system where citizens choose their representatives and to dismantle an unjust status quo where in too many places politicians are picking their voters. Now, here in California, you have an independent, citizen-led redistricting commission. You've taken power away from politicians who want to draw maps for their own benefit, and you've given it back to the people where it belongs. And that is what we want at the NDRC. We want a fair system. The organization I lead is not designed to gerrymander for Democrats. It's an attempt to ensure a fair process, a fair democracy in which the people are truly respected and fairly represented. So we're working to ensure that voting maps are drawn fairly and that the integrity of the Voting Rights Act is upheld. We're working to erase laws that make the casting of a ballot a function of your age, your ethnicity, or your party, and not your citizenship of this nation. We filed lawsuits supporting residents who've had their voting rights infringed in Alabama, in Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and North Carolina. Now, these lawsuits seek to abolish broken electoral systems that prevent people from electing candidates of their choice. We're supporting a lawsuit now to block the administration from adding a citizenship question to the census because it would dramatically depress the count in areas with significant Latino and immigrant populations. And the resultant bad census count is designed to reposition political representation toward areas most likely to elect Republicans when new maps get drawn in 2021. We have supported reform efforts in 5 states that will create, as you have here in California, independent commissions or make the redistricting process less partisan. Gerrymandering weakens our democracy by making some voters' ballots more powerful than others, but it also does damage well beyond Election Day. When politicians manipulate our electoral maps through partisan or racial gerrymandering, it intensifies polarization, it contributes to gridlock, and it deepens the cynicism that Americans feel about their government. And by eliminating truly competitive elections, gerrymandering encourages politicians to cater to the extremes of their party and to special interests while ignoring the people they are supposed to represent. It allows them to vote for laws that put the interests of a few before the well-being of all. And it's not a coincidence that in the states with the most extensive gerrymandering, the legislatures have used that illegitimate power to restrict access to the ballot box through discriminatory voter ID laws. Now, these attacks on our fundamental rights as citizens make the stakes in our elections over the next 2 years that much higher. Now, I am bound and determined to make sure that in the midst of an extended campaign for president, we do not lose sight of the critical state and local elections that will decide who controls the redistricting process in 2021. We simply must replace the current occupant of the White House. We have to. But that alone is not enough. What happens in state and local races over the next 2 years will shape, at a minimum, the next decade of our politics. We are politically and as a society at an existential moment in the history of this nation. The question before all of us is this: what more can we do as individuals and collectively to make real a vision of racial and social equality? What more can we do to break down the barriers, some long known, but others newly created, that have been put in place to undermine our democracy? Most importantly, how can we heal this divided nation and bring our fellow citizens together in the name of tolerance, nonviolence, compassion, love, and justice? Now, we all have the responsibility, not just the right, the responsibility to take part in our democratic process and to shape our society into one that reflects that which is best in us. Now, this is, as I said, a moment of great challenge and great consequence. Our task is substantial. Our success is not guaranteed, but I remain optimistic. In some ways, we can look to the past for the way forward. In the early 20th century, a small group of Jews and African Americans joined together to form something called the NAACP, one of the most powerful forces for positive change in our nation's history. During the Civil Rights era, Jews and African Americans again joined together to march and to protest and to fight for changes to our laws that would abolish a system of American apartheid. In 1958, when speaking to the American Jewish Congress, Dr. King said, and I quote, "Our unity is born of our common struggle for centuries, not only to rid ourselves of bondage, but to make oppression of any people by others an impossibility," unquote. In 1964, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, 3 black and Jewish civil rights foot soldiers, had their lives taken from them in Mississippi because they were registering people to vote. Today, we must resist those who would try to tear asunder this historic Jewish-black alliance and strengthen our historical bond so that we can continue the fight and lead the struggle that has meant so much for equality for both groups and now must encompass others. That is what this time, our time, calls for. We will write the next great chapter of America's story, but only if we come together. We must embrace, indeed celebrate, the diversity that is America. We must ensure that people of all faiths, races, ethnicities, and sexual orientations are treated with dignity and respect and given real opportunities to fully develop their talents. The change we seek is possible, but again, that change is not promised. So today, let us not merely reflect upon our past. Let's pledge our best efforts to protect the advances that we have inherited, make real the legacy that's been entrusted to each of us, and ensure a more just future for the next generation. This is our time to combat the forces that seek to divide us. with rhetoric and policies that are frightening. They're frightening, but they are historically familiar to blacks and Jews. We cannot wallow in despair. From our learned history, we know that we do not have the luxury of apathy or disengagement. In the great tradition of our forebears, we must fight, we must struggle to protect and to improve this democracy. Now, there has been an awakening of American engagement in citizenship over the past 2.5 years. But we can't allow this to only be a moment. It must become a sustained movement. It is time again for this nation to seek a new birth of freedom and of equality. That is our charge. And now, as easy as it might be, we must not look back towards a past that was comforting to too few and unjust to too many. That is not how you make America great again. So now is the time for strength and for resolve. We must use our combined voices and the tools of political involvement and peaceful protest that have always been the hallmark of progress in this country. We must continue marching. We must continue striving. And we must use our power at the voting booth to send a message around all of America about what kind of country we must become once again. We must do the difficult things, embrace the uncertainties of the future, and then shape that future in the way that truly great American generations always have. We must not give in to irrational fear and manufactured division, but embrace instead trust and national unity. So, let us rise to the challenges of our time, and let us signal to the world that in America today, the pursuit of a more perfect union lives on, the march toward the promised land goes on, and the belief that not only that we shall overcome, but that we will truly come together as one nation continues to guide our path. May God continue to bless this temple and all of its people, and may God continue to bless the United States of America. Thank you.